I'm Lorena Gonzalez. I am bisexual, a first-generation Mexican-American woman, and I grew up in a family that struggled with being low income. I'm originally from the south side of Chicago, and for those who aren't familiar with the city, Chicago is a tale of two cities, north and south. I come from the south side of Chicago, specifically the southwest side, where your zip code determines your health outcomes. I grew up in a vibrant Latina lower income neighborhood, and in my neighborhood you'll see colorful murals that line the blocks that showcase our Mexican cultural heritage. There are bustling Latina owned businesses, and there's a collective pride in place. But beyond that, there are also silent and sometimes invisible dangers all around. The southwest side of Chicago has some of the worst air quality in the city of Chicago. I grew up in a neighborhood that has dealt with a long legacy of environmental racism. We lived in the shadow of dirty industry. For this reason, we refer to our neighborhood as a sacrifice zone. To dirty industries, our lives were worth sacrificing in the name of profit. And if you looked around at my neighbors, we all had strikingly similar health histories. Many of us, including myself, had asthma. Many of us got it in childhood, like I did. There were folks who had lung disease and other respiratory conditions. And to us, that was no coincidence. Chicago is very segregated. So growing up, I thought that pollution, like we were experiencing in our side of the town, was normal. I thought that, like me and my neighbors, everybody had asthma. But it wasn't until my mom started having us go to school up on the north side. And that's sort of when my consciousness around systemic injustice, racial injustice began. And so when I went to school up north, I saw a lot of things that I really wasn't used to seeing. They had plenty of parks in any given direction. The streets were well maintained. The light posts were functional. And there were a ton of environmental amenities like trees that made their neighborhoods look beautiful. While I didn't have the vocabulary at the time to call things what they are, I knew it was disparity, and I felt it too. Now I want to touch a little bit further on my lifelong struggles with asthma, which is directly tied to the environment. As I was talking about, where I grew up was home to dozens of industrial polluters. And all of those industrial polluters release toxic chemicals in the air, or pollutants, that can lead to childhood asthma or adult asthma or a host of other health conditions. But at the time, this wasn't widespread knowledge. And what we know today is that communities of color, low income, and queer communities are disproportionately impacted by environmental injustice and the impacts of climate change. And so just to be clear, this is a systemic issue. So this isn't unique to Chicago. It's actually a global problem. And when we don't acknowledge it as a systemic or a structural problem, communities living in these conditions can often be made to feel as though they are personally responsible for the health conditions that they may be facing. And I'll use my mom as a perfect example of this. So before doctors arrived at my diagnosis that I had childhood asthma, that process, really put my mom through the ringer. And so there were a lot of times where I was hospitalized. I got put on a number of different medications, and all of this came with a hefty price tag. And in meeting with doctors at checkups and trying to figure out what it was, there was a lot of discussion around what happened in my household that could have led to me not being able to breathe. The doctors were pointing fingers at the fact that we had rodents, the fact that we had carpets. These were things that, as a renter, my mom didn't have a whole lot of control over. And so a lot of the time she blamed herself. I remember her crying, repeatedly. And as a kid, there's not much that you can do. Finally, my diagnoses came back, and we found out that I had childhood asthma. And at the time, doctors haven't really made the connection between childhood asthma and environmental triggers. And had that awareness around those triggers been part of the care that my family received at the time, that would have helped my mom in particular keep her family safe. And it's because of this that brought me to where I am today. My lived experience fueled my fire and has led me to becoming a climate advocate. And what I am focused on doing is making sure that all communities who are vulnerable to the long-lasting impacts of environmental injustice and those who will suffer the first and worst impacts of climate change are protected in whatever solutions that we bring forward. And while I work across the state, a big focus of mine is working in the Denver metro area, particularly in North Denver. That area has been named one of the nation's most polluted zip codes. And those neighborhoods are predominantly Latina. They are working class. This community very much resembles the one where I come from back home. And so tying this all together into how we can improve health equity, my mind immediately jumps to policy. And when we think about policy, we should think about considering health equity at the outset and making sure that the interests of our most vulnerable populations are included. And the best way to do that is making sure that you are co-creating policies and other solutions with the communities who are most impacted by these issues. And for the LGBTQ population, we have a harder time accessing affirming care, and we must be able to break through that barrier in order to make sure that our community is able to access life-saving care, no matter if it's an environmental issue, a climate issue, or other pressing issues, because they are all directly related. In order to achieve true health equity, we need to understand that people are not one-dimensional. And to get there, we need to make sure that we are advancing racial equity, that we are addressing environmental and climate injustice, and that we are working to improve the living conditions of LGBTQ populations and lower income folks. People like me, who are brown, queer, from a low-income background, and relegated to the margins of society, are worth protecting, and we deserve to live healthy lives just like everybody else.